From Ashes, a Key to the Impossible. Welcome to Mystery Sherlock. I am your host, Edward Sterling. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means a lot. Now, unlock the mystery. In glancing over my notes of the many singular adventures which I had the privilege of sharing with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I find that some are marked by violence, some by grotesque eccentricity, and a few by that cold and deliberate cunning which leaves a deeper impression upon the mind than any act of mere brutality. The affair of the key found in Ashes belongs to this latter class. Though it began, as so many of our cases did, in the quiet sitting room of Baker Street, it soon widened into one of those intricate inquiries in which every fact appeared trivial, until the whole, armed by Holmes's extraordinary gift of arrangement, stood revealed in a design as exact and pitiless as a geometrical proof. It was in the winter of 1893, and London lay for several days beneath one of those yellow fogs which seem less a condition of the atmosphere than a mood of the great city itself. The streets below our windows in Baker Street were muffled and uncertain. Omnibuses loomed out of the vapour like dark and lumbering beasts. The lamps shone with blurred halos, while every sound, the cry of the newsboy, the rattle of wheels, the distant whistle of a constable, came to the ear, softened and made strangely remote. Holmes had passed the morning in one of those alternations of languor and intense activity which were familiar to all who knew him. For an hour he had lounged upon the sofa with half-closed eyes, his long, nervous fingers pressed together, and his gaunt profile outlined against the firelight with an austerity worthy of an ascetic. Then with sudden energy he had risen, taken from the mantel his chemical monograph, and covered several sheets with notes, which to my medical eye might as well have been cuneiform characters for all the meaning I could extract from them. I had seated myself in the armchair opposite, with the morning paper, but I confess that my attention wandered from the columns before me to the man across the hearth. There was at such times a peculiar vitality about Holmes, a sense of power held in reserve, which made even his silence arresting. "You are observing me, Watson," said he at last, without raising his eyes from the page before him. "I was not aware that I had made the attempt covertly. My dear fellow, Orchid, when you desire concealment, you should not lower your paper by precisely 2 inches every 40 seconds. It is a trick as characteristic as Lestrade's cough." I laughed. "You will not permit a man even the privacy of his own curiosity?" "On the contrary," said Holmes, laying aside the paper and steepling his fingers, "I encourage it, provided it proceeds upon a scientific basis. You were wondering whether I had at length found some outlet for my energies after 3 days of enforced inaction. The answer is that I have not. London, for the moment, has become honest, or at least dull." "You distinguish between the two?" "Often. Dullness is merely the absence of imagination, whether in virtue or crime." Before I could respond, there came a firm tread upon the stair, followed by a brisk knock. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir. The gentleman says the matter is most pressing." Holmes glanced at the card and gave a slight lift of the brows. "Mr. Alistair Penrose, of Chalcot Square. Show him up, if you please." A moment later our visitor entered, and I saw at once that here was no commonplace client. He was a man of perhaps 35, tall, well-dressed, and clean-shaven, with regular features that might have been handsome had they not been marred by an expression of acute strain. His clothing was of excellent quality, though put on in haste. One glove had been buttoned incorrectly. There was mud upon the left hem of his trousers, and his hat, which he held crushed in both hands, bore the marks of recent rain and rough usage. Yet what most struck me was not his disorder, but the manner in which he controlled it. He was plainly labouring under some severe agitation, and yet spoke with a deliberate effort at composure. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, I crave your pardon for this intrusion, but I have been advised, indeed urged, to place myself in your hands without delay." "You are very welcome, Mr. Penrose," said Holmes, indicating a chair. "You have come from the northwest, have dismissed your cab at the Marylebone Road to avoid being followed to this address, and have slept little or not at all." The man stared. "Good God, sir, that is true, every word of it." "It is also unimportant," said Holmes carelessly. "Pray sit down and tell me what has occurred." Mr. Penrose sank into the chair, though his eyes remained fixed upon Holmes with an expression in which amazement struggled with relief. "I am not easily shaken, Mr. Holmes, at least. I had thought so until this morning. I have known business anxieties, and I served as a junior attaché in Vienna during a season of political disturbances, yet I declare to you that the events of the last 12 hours have left me more unnerved than either." Holmes closed his eyes and leaned back, while I took up my notebook. "You are a secretary, or have been one?" said Holmes. Penrose started again. "I was private secretary to the late Sir Julius Waverton for 4 years." "And at present?" "I am attached, in a confidential capacity, to Mr. Edgar Dorrance of Dorrance and Vale Shipping." "Exactly. Continue." It is impossible to convey the effect which these swift and effortless deductions produced upon strangers. To me, long accustomed as I was to Holmes's methods, they still retained something of the dramatic. But upon our visitor, they acted as a complete surrender of reserve. "You know so much already," said he, "that I may as well place all before you plainly. Last night I dined with my employer, Mr. Edgar Dorrance, at his house in Campden Hill. There were only 4 at table: Mr. Dorrance, his niece, Miss Clara Dorrance, myself, and Mr. Basil Fenwick, who has for some months been engaged upon legal work connected with the firm. After dinner my employer retired early, complaining of fatigue. Miss Dorrance went to the drawing-room. Fenwick remained with me over the port for perhaps half an hour. There was nothing unusual in the evening, save that Mr. Dorrance appeared preoccupied and more irritable than is his habit. He moistened his lips. This morning, at 7:15, the butler entered Mr. Dorrance's study, for my employer had evidently risen in the night and gone there. He found the room in disorder. The grate was still warm, papers had been burned, one chair was overturned, and Mr. Dorrance himself was dead. I glanced quickly at Holmes, but his face remained impassive. "How had he died?" he asked. "There was a wound upon the temple. The police surgeon says it might have been caused by a fall against the marble edge of the hearth. Yet that is not all. A small iron key was found among the ashes in the grate." Holmes opened his eyes. "In the ashes?" "Yes, that is the singular point. Not beside the grate, nor under the fender, but among the blackened remains of burned papers. The servants swear that no such key belonged to the study. Mr. Dorrance kept his important documents in a locked, japanned dispatch box. But that box was unopened, and the key to it was still upon his watch chain." "And the iron key?" "It is old-fashioned, blackened by fire, and of no obvious use in the house. Lestrade, who has taken charge, believes that it may have been wrapped in the papers by accident and thrown upon the fire, but that explanation seems to me impossible." "Why impossible?" Holmes asked. "Because," said Penrose, leaning forward and lowering his voice, "I saw that key in Mr. Dorrance's hand yesterday afternoon." Holmes's fingers tightened for an instant upon the arm of his chair. "You are certain?" "Perfectly. I entered the study with a ledger. Mr. Dorrance was standing near the window, examining a small key of dark metal. He thrust it at once into his waistcoat pocket with an air of annoyance, and asked by what right I came in without knocking, and it was so unlike his ordinary manner that I remembered both the object and the rebuke." "And you mentioned this to Lestrade?" "I did." "What was his answer?" that it gave additional reason to suppose the death accidental. If Dorrance had intended to burn old papers and had dropped the key among them, the whole matter was explained. Yet I know it was not so simple. There was fear in the house last night, Mr. Holmes. I felt it, though I could not have said why. And this morning, after the body had been discovered, Miss Dorrance told me something which has made the matter infinitely darker. Holmes leaned forward now with that sudden intentness which I had learned to associate with the scent of a genuine problem. Well, she told me that her uncle had received by the last post yesterday evening a note without signature. She saw only the envelope upon the salver, but she overheard him say to himself in a most disturbed voice, "So it has come at last." Later, when she bade him good night at the study door, he had a paper in his hand and the fire burning high. He asked her whether the side entrance was bolted. She answered that it was. He then told her that if anyone called, no matter at what hour, he was not at home. "A prudent man," murmured Holmes. "Or a frightened one." "Very likely both. Was there anyone who desired Mr. Dorrance's death?" Penrose hesitated. "He was a man of affairs, Mr. Holmes, and not universally beloved. His dealings were forceful. He had rivals in business, enemies among dismissed employees, and, I fear, some private entanglements of which I know little. But there is one other matter." "Pray give it." "Late last night, I cannot say the exact hour, but it was after 1. I was unable to sleep. My room is in the east wing. As I crossed the corridor, I saw a light under the study door below. I descended halfway down the stair. I heard voices. One was certainly Mr. Dorrance's, the other I could not distinguish. Then there came a sharp sound as though a poker or iron bar had struck stone. After that, silence." "Why did you not go farther?" Penrose coloured. "I believed myself to be overhearing a private business conversation, and I had no wish to play the spy. It is an omission for which I reproach myself bitterly." Holmes rose and stood with his back to the fire, his head sunk upon his breast. For several moments he remained silent. "You have done wisely to come," said he at last. Has anyone besides Lestrade been informed of these details?" "No one." "Excellent. Then for the present you will say nothing further. We shall go at once to Campden Hill. Watson, your hat, if you please." Our visitor drew a breath of relief and half rose from his chair. "You will take the case?" "My dear sir," said Holmes with the faintest smile, "the case has taken me." As we prepared to leave, I observed that Holmes paused for one instant beside the mantel and cast his eye over the disorder of our visitor's attire. "You are wearing another man's overcoat, Mr. Penrose." Penrose turned in astonishment. "I caught up the first in the hall. It belongs to Fenwick." "In heaven's name, how could you know it?" Holmes took the coat collar gently between finger and thumb. "Because you are a careful man in ordinary circumstances. Hallam would not choose a coat with a frayed velvet collar, because the sleeves are a shade too short for your arms, and because there is a smear of grey sealing wax upon the cuff, a substance which, I observe, has also stained the first finger of Mr. Basil Fenwick's right hand in the portrait photograph protruding from your pocket-book." Our visitor could only stare. "There, Watson," said Holmes as we descended the stairs together into the yellow swirl of the London fog, "is a small example of the value of observing trifles. Let us see whether the larger facts are equally obliging." It was thus that we set forth upon the singular business of Edgar Dorrance's death, and little did I then imagine that the blackened key lying among the ashes of a study grate would lead us through falsehood, terror, thick and long-buried guilt to one of the most curious conclusions in all my experience of Sherlock Holmes. The cab which bore us to Campden Hill crept at a cautious pace through the thickening fog, its lamps glowing like dim embers in the murk. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame drawn into itself, his chin sunk upon his chest, and his hat pulled low over his keen eyes. To the casual observer he might have appeared drowsy, yet I knew well that this was but the outward sign of the most intense mental activity. Once or twice his fingers moved restlessly as though arranging unseen pieces upon an imaginary board. "You observed our visitor closely, Watson," said he suddenly. "As closely as I was able. He is an intelligent and self-possessed man, though much shaken." "And honest?" "I should be inclined to think so." Holmes gave a faint murmur.
Inclinations are the enemy of accuracy. Still, we shall test him soon enough. There are already 1 or 2 points which invite closer scrutiny." "You refer to the key?" "To the key and to the ashes. It is seldom that a man burns papers at such an hour without good reason. It is rarer still that he leaves behind any fragment capable of identification. The presence of that key in the grate is, to my mind, either a blunder of the most extraordinary kind or a deliberate signal." "A signal? To whom?" Holmes did not answer. The cab slowed, then turned sharply, and at last drew up before a large, well-appointed house whose facade loomed indistinctly through the fog. A constable stood at the gate, and a second figure, wrapped in an ulster, paced impatiently upon the steps. "Ah, there is Lestrade," said Holmes as we alighted.
The inspector greeted us with a brisk nod, though I detected in his manner that mixture of relief and professional reserve which Holmes's presence invariably inspired in him. "I am glad you have come, Mr. Holmes, though I cannot say that the matter is quite so mysterious as your client would have you believe. Still, a second opinion can do no harm." "Nor a first one, perhaps," returned Holmes mildly. "You have preserved the scene?" "Exactly as it was found. Come inside and you shall judge for yourself." We followed him into the house, where a subdued air of alarm hung over everything. A maid passed us in the hall with a frightened glance, and somewhere above there came the faint sound of a door hastily closed. Lestrade led the way down a short corridor and threw open a door upon the right. "Oh, this is the study." It was a spacious and comfortable room, lined with bookshelves and furnished in a sober but tasteful manner. Yet the signs of disturbance were at once apparent. A chair lay upon its side near the hearth. The rug was rucked and disordered, as though by a sudden struggle or fall. Upon the marble edge of the fireplace I observed a dark stain, which I did not doubt to be the mark of blood. Holmes stood for a moment just within the threshold, his eyes moving slowly from point to point. Then, with that swift, cat-like grace which was characteristic of him, he crossed the room and dropped upon one knee beside the grate. "Do not touch anything," said Lestrade quickly. "My dear Inspector," Holmes returned, "if I touch, I do so to observe. You, I perceive,
"Have already done so to disturb." Lestrade flushed slightly but made no reply. Holmes leaned forward, his face close to the ashes. He took from his pocket a small lens and examined the contents of the grate with minute attention. For several minutes he remained thus, utterly silent, while I and the inspector watched him. "At what hour was the body discovered?" he asked at last. 7:15, said Lestrade. "The butler entered to light the fire and found the room as you see it." "And the fire had burned itself out by then?" "Almost. There was still a little warmth." Holmes nodded. "And the key?" Lestrade stepped forward and produced a small object wrapped in paper. He unfolded it, revealing a blackened iron key of an old-fashioned pattern. There it is, found just there among the ashes. Holmes took it delicately between his fingers.
I'm turning it so that the light fell upon its surface. His eyes narrowed. "Curious," said he. "You see nothing remarkable?" Lestrade asked. "On the contrary, I see a great deal, but I prefer to confirm rather than to speculate." He rose and moved to the writing desk, which stood near the window. It was in good order, save that a single drawer stood slightly ajar. "This has been examined?" "Of course." "And nothing missing?" "Nothing of value." Holmes smiled faintly. "Value is a relative term, Inspector." He closed the drawer gently and turned his attention to the hearth once more. Then with a sudden motion he stooped and picked up a small fragment from the rug. "What have you there?" I asked. "A trifle, Watson, a mere trifle." He slipped it into his pocket before I could examine it.
And I confess that I felt a certain impatience at his secrecy. "Now," said he, "let us consider the position of the body." Lestrade indicated the spot before the fireplace. "He was found lying there, his head near the hearth. The wound is here." He touched his own temple. "And there was no weapon?" "None." Holmes paced slowly across the room, his hands behind his back. "A man rises in the night, comes to his study, burns certain papers, and is then, what? Startled? Attacked? Or does he fall by mischance? The evidence, as it stands, admits of each possibility. Yet there are details which resist such easy classification." He paused before the window, then turned sharply. "I should like to see the servants and Miss Dorrance, if she is able to receive us." Lestrade nodded. "They are in the drawing-room, but I warn you."
The young lady is much distressed." "I shall be as gentle as the facts permit," said Holmes. As we left the study, I could not but glance back at the cold hearth and the thin layer of grey ash within it. Somewhere among those charred remains lay the origin of the mystery, a mystery which I felt certain had already begun to take shape in the mind of my remarkable friend, though to me it remained as obscure as the fog which still pressed thickly against the windows of the house. We found Miss Dorrance in a long, low drawing-room at the rear of the house, where the fog pressed dimly against the tall windows and softened the outlines of the garden beyond. She rose as we entered, and I was struck at once by the self-command with which she bore her grief. She was a young woman of perhaps 28, pale, with dark, thoughtful eyes, and a manner at once gentle and resolute. Though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her, her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Mr. Holmes, I am grateful that you have come. Mr. Penrose has told me of your abilities." Holmes inclined his head. "I fear they are often exaggerated, Miss Dorrance, but I shall do what I can. Pray be seated." She resumed her chair, and we gathered about her, Holmes opposite, Lestrade somewhat to one side, and I near the mantel, notebook in hand. "You were the last person to see your uncle alive?" Holmes began. "Yes. It was shortly before 11. He had gone to his study after dinner, as was his habit. I followed later to bid him good night." "You observed nothing unusual at that time?" She hesitated, then said, "Only that he seemed troubled, and more so than earlier in the evening. He was standing by the fire, holding a paper, which he placed at once into the flames when I entered. I remarked upon it, but he answered sharply that it was of no consequence." "And the envelope?" "It lay upon the table, plain, without crest or mark. I did not see the contents, but I heard him say, in a tone I shall not soon forget, 'So it has come at last.'" Holmes's eyes flickered. "Did he explain himself?" "No. When I questioned him, he dismissed the matter, but before I left he asked whether the side entrance was secured. I told him that it was. He then said that if anyone should call at whatever hour, he was not to be disturbed. And that struck you as unusual? Very. My uncle was not a man to hide from visitors. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Miss Dorrance, I must ask you to recall your impressions with the greatest care. Did you hear or see anything during the night which might bear upon this matter? She clasped her hands more tightly. I slept poorly. At some hour past midnight, I cannot say precisely when, I thought I heard a sound below, not loud but distinct, as though something metallic had struck against stone. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Did you rise?" he asked. "No, I told myself it was the settling of the house, or perhaps a servant moving about. I regret that I did not investigate." "There is no cause for reproach," said Holmes gently. "Your evidence is of the greatest value." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "We have already established that Mr. Penrose heard something of the same kind. It is perfectly consistent with a fall against the hearth, or there is nothing to suggest the presence of another person." Holmes did not look at him. "You have spoken of Mr. Basil Fenwick," he continued. "What is your opinion of that gentleman?" A faint colour rose to her cheeks. "Mr. Fenwick is well regarded. He has been of assistance to my uncle in several matters of business. He is attentive, perhaps overly so, but I have never had reason to distrust him." "Yet you hesitate?" She met Holmes's gaze with quiet firmness. "I hesitate because this house has never before known suspicion, Mr. Holmes. I would not be the first to introduce it without cause." "A commendable sentiment," said Holmes. "And Mr. Penrose?" "He has been in my uncle's service for some months. He is diligent and discreet. My uncle trusted him." Holmes rose and walked slowly to the window, where he stood for a moment looking out into the grey obscurity. When he turned back, his expression had resumed its customary composure. "There is one final question, Miss Dorrance. Had your uncle any private room, cabinet, or repository, apart from the study, in which he kept papers of particular importance?" She considered. "None that I know of. The dispatch box in the study contained his most confidential documents." "And the key to that box?" "Always upon his person." Holmes nodded. "I thank you. You have been of the greatest assistance." As we withdrew, I could not but admire the tact with which he had conducted the interview, drawing from the distressed lady every detail of significance without once pressing her beyond endurance. Yet I observed also that his manner, though courteous, had grown more intent with each answer she gave, or in the corridor outside, Lestrade turned to him. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you have heard all that there is to hear. The case resolves itself into a simple accident, with a few trifling peculiarities." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Inspector, the peculiarities are the case." "And what do you make of them?" "That," said Holmes, drawing on his gloves with deliberate care, "is what I propose to discover before the day is out. But first, I should be obliged if you would permit me a few words with Mr. Basil Fenwick." There was something in his tone which caused even the practical Lestrade to pause. As for myself, I felt that we were at last approaching the first true turning point of the investigation, though the path which led to it was still hidden from me as completely as ever. Mr. Basil Fenwick was shown to us in a smaller morning room adjoining the hall, a gentleman whose appearance, at first glance, would have satisfied the most exacting standard of respectability. He was of medium height, well built, and carefully dressed, though not with the haste which had marked Mr. Penrose. His fair hair was brushed with precision, his collar faultless, and his manner composed to the point of austerity. Yet, as Holmes had already observed, there was upon the forefinger of his right hand a faint smear of grey sealing wax. imperfectly removed, which at once fixed my attention. "You wish to see me, Mr. Holmes?" said he, with a slight inclination of the head. "If you please, Mr. Fenwick, we are endeavouring to establish a clear account of last night's events, and I am informed that you were among the last to see Mr. Dorrance alive." "That is correct," he replied calmly. "I remained with Mr. Penrose for a short time after dinner. We discussed certain business matters of no consequence to this inquiry. I then retired to my room at approximately 10:30. "And did not leave it again?" "I did not." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You slept soundly?" "I did." "You heard no unusual sound during the night?" "None whatsoever." There was not the slightest hesitation in his answers. Yet I thought I detected a certain rigidity in his bearing, as though each reply were measured and weighed before utterance. "You are engaged, I believe, upon legal work for Mr. Dorrance?" Holmes continued. "Yes. I have been assisting in the consolidation of certain shipping interests and the preparation of documents relating to overseas holdings." "Important documents?" "Undoubtedly." "Of a nature to excite interest or opposition?" Fenwick's eyes flickered for the first time. "In business, Mr. Holmes, opposition is to be expected." "Quite so. And these documents, were they kept in the dispatch box in the study?" "Some were. Others remained in my own possession." Holmes nodded, as though the answer were of no particular consequence. "You will forgive a trifling question," said he lightly, "but I could not help observing a trace of sealing wax upon your finger. Have you been engaged in correspondence this morning?" Fenwick glanced instinctively at his hand, then allowed it to fall again at his side. "A minor matter."
I sealed a letter before breakfast." "Indeed. To whom was it addressed?" "To my chambers." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precautionary habits are admirable. May I ask whether you are accustomed to using grey wax?" It happened to be at hand. Holmes turned away, as though dismissing the point entirely. "And your relations with Mr. Dorrance? Were they cordial?" "Entirely so." "No disagreement? No difference of opinion upon any matter of importance?" "None that would bear upon this unfortunate incident." Holmes was silent for a moment, then said abruptly, "You are left-handed, Mr. Fenwick." The other started very slightly. "No, sir, I am not." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "No? Yet the wax upon your right forefinger suggests that you held the seal in your left hand. A right-handed man would more naturally soil the thumb or forefinger of the opposite hand." Fenwick's composure tightened, but he answered smoothly, "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I am right-handed. The matter is of no significance." "None whatever," said Holmes, with an air of indifference which was, I knew, profoundly misleading. At that moment Lestrade, who had been shifting impatiently from foot to foot, broke in. "I think we are wandering from the point. There is no evidence that Mr. Fenwick left his room during the night. The servants can attest that no one passed along the corridor." Holmes turned to him. "On the contrary, Inspector, we have evidence that someone was in the study after midnight, in conversation with Mr. Dorrance." "That may have been Mr. Dorrance himself," said Lestrade shortly. Holmes made no reply.
He had stepped closer to Fenwick and was regarding him with that peculiar, intent scrutiny which seemed to lay bare the very thoughts behind a man's eyes. "One last question, Mr. Fenwick. Did you, at any time yesterday, observe in Mr. Dorrance's possession a small iron key of unusual pattern?" Fenwick hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, yet long enough for Holmes to detect it. "I did not," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "I thank you. That will be all for the present." As Fenwick withdrew, I turned eagerly to my friend. You believe him to be withholding something? I whispered. Holmes's expression was grave. My dear Watson, he has already withheld it. And the significance of the wax? Ah, said Holmes softly. That is one of several small facts which, taken alone, mean nothing.
Is but taken together, everything. He moved toward the door, then paused and glanced back down the corridor toward the study. The key in the ashes, the burned paper, the midnight visitor, and now Mr. Basil Fenwick's careful omissions. There is a pattern here, Watson. It is faint as yet, but it strengthens with each thread we draw. And what of Mr. Penrose? Holmes's lips curved slightly. We shall come to Mr. Penrose in due course. For the moment, let us return to the study. There is still something there which has not yet spoken, and I have the strongest impression that when it does, it will do so very clearly indeed. We returned at once to the study, where the dim winter light struggled through the fog and lay in a pale band across the carpet. The room had lost none of its oppressive stillness. Indeed,
But now that the first impressions had passed, I became more conscious of a certain unnatural order beneath the apparent disorder, as though the confusion had not arisen from chaos, but had been carefully arranged to resemble it. Holmes closed the door behind us and stood for a moment in silence, his eyes half closed, his head inclined slightly forward. It was an attitude which I had often seen precede one of those sudden illuminations which seemed to spring full-formed from his mind. "Watson," said he at last, "pray take note of the position of the chair." "The overturned one near the hearth?" "Precisely. Now observe the angle at which it lies. Does it suggest to you the direction of a fall?" I examined it more closely. If Mr. Dorrance had stumbled backward, he might have struck it and overturned it in that fashion. Holmes shook his head gently. Not so. A backward fall would have carried the chair away from the hearth, not toward it. The displacement is inconsistent with accident. Then it was disturbed afterward? Or before, said Holmes quietly. We must not assume sequence until we have proved it. He crossed once more to the grate and knelt, sifting the ashes with the delicate precision of a chemist at his bench. From time to time he paused, holding some minute fragment to the light, then letting it fall again. "There is less here than there should be," he murmured. "Less?" "Yes. If a quantity of papers had been burned hastily, we should expect a mixture of ash and partially charred remains, edges perhaps, or corners not wholly consumed. Yet here we have a remarkably uniform residue. You think the papers were burned elsewhere?" "I think," said Holmes, "that they were not all burned here." He rose and moved swiftly to the writing desk, opening the drawer which he had earlier examined. From it he drew out several sheets of blank paper which he held up against the light. "Observe, Watson. These are of a particular watermark, Dorrance and Vale, private issue. Now look again at the ashes." I bent closer, but to my untrained eye they revealed nothing beyond a fine grey powder. Holmes smiled faintly. "You perceive nothing? Yet I assure you that among these ashes there is not a single fragment bearing that watermark. The papers burned here were of another kind. Then Mr. Durrance destroyed documents not belonging to his own business? Or someone did so in his presence? The distinction, though slight, sent a curious chill through me. Holmes turned abruptly and strode to the hearth, examining once more the dark stain upon the marble edge. "The inspector suggests that this was caused by a fall. It is possible, but let us consider. A fall implies loss of balance. Loss of balance implies either accident or incapacity. Yet there is no sign of prolonged struggle, no scattered objects, no evidence of a desperate attempt to recover footing." "You mean that the blow may have been struck intentionally?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that the position of the wound must be reconciled with the position of the body, and that neither, at present—"
accords with the theory of accident. He turned then with sudden energy to the rug and knelt once more at the spot where he had earlier picked up the small fragment. "Here," said he, beckoning me. "Do you observe this faint indentation?" I knelt beside him. The fibres of the carpet were indeed slightly depressed, though so subtly that I might easily have overlooked it. "A heel mark?" I suggested. "Not precisely. It is too narrow for a boot, and too sharply defined for the ordinary tread. It suggests the edge of some object, metal perhaps, pressed down with considerable force." "The poker?" Holmes shook his head. "The poker lies there, and its dimensions do not correspond. Besides, such a mark would not be so clean." He rose slowly, his face thoughtful. "We have then a man who burns papers not his own, a key found among those ashes, a blow or fall whose nature is uncertain, and at least one other presence in the room during the night. Add to this Mr. Fenwick's convenient slumber and Mr. Penrose's selective recollection, and we have a situation of some interest." At that moment there came a discreet knock at the door, and the butler entered. "Beg pardon, sir, but the inspector requested that you be informed. Mr. Penrose has asked whether he may speak with you again. He says it is of urgency." Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. "Show him in." The man withdrew, and a moment later Penrose entered, his agitation even more pronounced than before. His face was pale, and there was a tremor in his voice which he made little effort to conceal. "Mr. Holmes, I fear I have made a grave omission, something which I ought to have told you earlier, but the confusion—"
"Why, the shock. I did not realize its importance." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You may repair the omission now." Penrose glanced over his shoulder as though to assure himself that the door was closed. "When I saw Mr. Dorrance yesterday afternoon with the key, he was not alone." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Indeed? And who was with him?" Penrose drew a breath. "Mr. Basil Fenwick." The announcement fell into the stillness of the room with a weight which I felt rather than heard. Holmes did not start, nor did his expression alter, yet there was in the quiet fixing of his eyes upon Penrose a concentration so intense that the latter faltered beneath it. "You are quite certain of this?" said Holmes at last. "Perfectly. I had occasion to return to the study for a ledger. I paused at the door, which was ajar, and I saw them together. Mr. Fenwick stood near the desk. Mr. Dorrance had the key in his hand. They were speaking in low tones, but I could not distinguish the words." "And you mentioned this to no one?" "No, it seemed a private matter." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Naturally. You have done well to correct the omission. You may leave us for a moment." When Penrose had withdrawn, Holmes turned slowly to Lestrade. "Inspector, you will oblige me by having both Mr. Fenwick and Miss Dorrance present in this room, and pray instruct your constable that no one is to leave the house." Lestrade hesitated, then nodded. There was something in Holmes's manner which discouraged argument. Within a few minutes the two were brought in, Fenwick composed but pale, Miss Dorrance anxious and uncertain. Penrose stood near the door, and his eyes moving restlessly from one face to another. Holmes took his position by the hearth, the dead man's last vantage point, as though he would reconstruct the scene from that very spot. "We have now," said he, "reached a stage at which concealment serves no useful purpose. The facts, though scattered, are sufficiently complete to admit of arrangement. I shall ask you all to listen with patience, and, if I err, to correct me." He paused, then continued in that clear, measured tone which I had learned to associate with the unravelling of a complex problem. Mr. Dorrance received yesterday evening a note which greatly disturbed him. It was not, as has been supposed, a threat of violence, but a demand, one which he had long dreaded. The phrase overheard by Miss Dorrance, "so it has come at last," is not the language of sudden alarm,
Has but of anticipated reckoning. Miss Dorrance gave a faint cry. My uncle, what do you mean? I mean, said Holmes gently, that your uncle was in possession of certain documents which did not rightly belong to him. Documents of great value, not merely in a financial sense, but as instruments of power. They concerned, I have reason to believe, certain shipping interests and concessions overseas, matters upon which fortunes might depend. Fenwick shifted slightly, but said nothing. These documents, Holmes continued, were known to Mr. Basil Fenwick, who had been engaged upon the legal aspects of the business. It was he who recognized their true significance, and he who determined to secure them for himself. That is false, cried Fenwick sharply. Holmes raised a hand. Pray allow me to finish. Yesterday afternoon you confronted Mr.
Dorrance. He had in his hand a key, not to the dispatch box, but to another repository, one of which only he and yourself were aware. The key found in the ashes is that key. You demanded access, he refused. The matter was left unresolved for the moment. Fenwick's face had grown rigid, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Later, Holmes went on, you returned. The note which so disturbed Mr. Dorrance was in fact from you, a final demand that he yield the documents or face exposure. He agreed to meet you in the study at night when the house was quiet. That is the second voice heard by Mr. Penrose. Penrose started, but Holmes did not look at him. In the study the discussion grew heated. Mr. Dorrance, recognizing at last the danger in which he stood, resolved to destroy the papers rather than surrender them. He placed them upon the fire. You attempted to prevent him. There was a struggle. In the course of it he was struck, whether by your hand or by the edge of the hearth is immaterial, and fell, receiving the fatal injury. That is conjecture, said Fenwick hoarsely. It is deduction, returned Holmes calmly. You then perceived the danger of your position. The papers were partially destroyed, but not wholly. You gathered what remained, intending to complete their destruction elsewhere. In your haste, however, you overlooked one detail, the key which had fallen among the ashes. Holmes took the blackened key from the table and held it up. You had handled it, and in so doing, you transferred to it traces of grey sealing wax, precisely the substance upon your finger this morning. That wax, Mr. Fenwick, is of a particular composition used in your chambers. It is not found in this house. Fenwick's composure broke. This is absurd. You have no proof. On the contrary, said Holmes quietly, I have proof of a kind which you cannot refute. The fragment which I picked from the rug is part of a sealing wax impression, broken during your struggle. It corresponds exactly with the residue upon your finger. Moreover, the ashes in the grate contain no trace of the paper used by Mr. Dorrance in his business, but do contain fragments of a different stock, legal foolscap of the type employed in your work. You brought those papers with you. You burned them here to mislead the investigation. There was a long silence. Then Fenwick sank suddenly into a chair, his face buried in his hands. It was not meant to be so, he muttered.
He forced me. He would have ruined me. Lestrade stepped forward. That will do. I must trouble you to come with me. As the inspector placed his hand upon the man's shoulder, Fenwick made no resistance. He rose unsteadily and allowed himself to be led from the room. Miss Dorrance had turned pale, but she faced Holmes with a courage which moved me deeply. And my uncle, she said. You spoke of documents, of wrongdoing. Holmes bowed his head slightly. Your uncle was a man of ability, Miss Dorrance, but not without blemish. He had, I fear, allowed ambition to outrun scruple. It is a misfortune which has overtaken better men. She said nothing more, but I saw that her composure cost her dearly. As we left the house some time later, the fog had begun to lift, and the outlines of the street emerged once more into clarity.
Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his hands behind his back. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "what think you of our case? It is, as you said, a matter in which every trifle proved of consequence. Yet I confess that the key itself seems almost incidental." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my dear fellow, it was the pivot upon which the whole turned. A thing misplaced is often a thing revealed. The key in the ashes was not merely an object, it was a contradiction, and where there is contradiction there is truth to be found." "And Mr. Penrose?" I asked. "A conscientious man, but not an observant one. He saw more than he understood, and understood less than he saw. It is a common failing." We had reached Baker Street. Holmes paused at the door and glanced up at the clearing sky. "There is a certain satisfaction," said he, "in restoring order where confusion has been deliberately contrived. Yet I cannot but reflect that the true mystery lies not in the crime, but in the motives which give rise to it." He opened the door and stepped inside. "Come, Watson, the day is not yet done, and London, I think, may soon have need of us again.